Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar about the 6 keys to winning the digital marketing wars. Today's webinar will be presented by myself, Jessica, a product marketing manager at SimilarWeb, and Dr. Stephen Kraus, SimilarWeb's Chief of Insights.
Hello everybody, thanks for joining us today.
Steve is author of 3 books and many articles on consumer insights, digital trends, and marketing success. His insights are regularly quoted in the media, and his recent TED Talk explored how economic bifurcation is reshaping consumer behavior in every category, and even redefining the American dream itself. Steve has a PhD in social psychology from Harvard University. So thank you, Steve, for being with us today.
Thank you.
So the webinar will run for about 30 or 40 minutes. Please do ask questions throughout the webinar using the question pane that you should see on the screen at the moment. And we really want to hear from you today. So we will answer all of your questions at the end of today's webinar, where we should have about 15 minutes for a Q&A session. So a little bit about SimilarWeb before we jump in. So SimilarWeb is headquartered in Tel Aviv and has offices all around the world serving our global market. We recently raised $47 million, which has taken us to a total raised of over $110 million. This latest round will help us scale our business even further and continue to develop innovative, best-in-class market intelligence solutions to meet the mass demand that we're seeing today. Our unique multidimensional data collection approach is the foundation of our entire business. We leverage hundreds of sources of data, which we categorize into 4 distinct groups: global panel data, global ISP data, public data sources, and direct measurement data. We build and partner with hundreds of consumer products which are installed on hundreds of millions of global devices and continue to grow. SimilarWeb also partners with ISPs, internet service providers around the world that provide data almost identical in structure as our panel data. This data is used to supplement our insights about the digital behavior worldwide. SimilarWeb also captures and indexes public data from over 1 billion websites and app pages every month. And finally, SimilarWeb leverages a growing data set of hundreds of thousands of websites and apps who share their direct measurement data. And having the ability to measure our estimations against directly measured data is one of the most critical functions in accurate statistical sampling. So using all of the techniques mentioned above, SimilarWeb is able to generate intelligent estimations across all sites and apps for all geographies. Our customers access SimilarWeb insights via 3 primary means: the SimilarWeb Pro, our SaaS platform, SimilarWeb Digital Insights, customized reports, and SimilarWeb's API, which are designed by experts to get you the right insights at the right time to help you win your market. SimilarWeb provides insights on every website and app in the world, analyzing at the level of a website, an industry, a keyword, or an app category. We provide data such as traffic volume, traffic sources, as well as engagement metrics, audience data, and much, much more. SimilarWeb has customers across many industries, including retail, travel, consumer goods, consumer finance, as well as many large agencies and brands. And you can see a few examples here of customers that we work with. A recurring theme in today's webinar will be all about analyzing your data in the context of your market. If you don't know what the competition are doing, you're analyzing your data in a silo and may well be misinterpreting exactly what your digital market share is. So with SimilarWeb, we empower you with the insights you need to win your market. We give you digital market intelligence for every website and every app worldwide to help you understand, track, and grow your market share. So just before I hand over to Steve for the core part of our webinar, we wanted to do a quick poll just to hear from our audience that's with us today. So I'm just going to put that up on screen right now. You should see that poll up there. And today's questions, as you can see, you can all start placing your vote. We want to know what is your biggest digital marketing challenge? Is it increasing traffic to your site, improving your online conversion rate, understanding your competitor's strategy or performance, or building the awareness or reputation of your brand? So it would be great if you can all place your votes now. I'll give us a few more seconds to do that.
I love these moments of anticipation. You never quite know what people are going to say.
I know. But it's really great for us to hear from the audience, and we want to understand your pain points, your challenges, and hopefully today's webinar will help solve some of them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so a couple more seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll and share with you the results of the vote. Okay, I'm closing the poll now. And you should all see the poll results on the screen. So that's really interesting. A nice mix of answers we can see there. So we can see that the most popular was increasing traffic to your site, followed by building the awareness and reputation of your brand and improving your online conversion rate. But that's nice to see that all of the challenges and all of the digital market challenges people are facing. Okay, I'm going to hide that now, and I'm going to hand over to Steve, who is going to walk us through the webinar.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that's a great entree into talking about the 6 keys to winning the digital marketing wars. I thought it was so interesting how the results were pretty dispersed over those 4 big challenges. And the challenge that actually came in last on the poll was focused on competitive intelligence, which is one of the things that I wanted to start off my session of the presentation talking about, because I do think it is really quite often overlooked. So I am going to talk about 6 keys to winning the digital marketing wars. I'm not going to literally talk about every word on that slide, because we're going to step through these 6 keys as we go along in the presentation. But I do want to start with the notion that I often say is just the idea of stop flying blind. That quite often when we go out, we work with different companies, we often see a lack of competitive insight. At SimilarWeb, we describe ourselves as a digital market intelligence firm. And one of the ways that I think about that is that market intelligence is the combination of business intelligence and competitive intelligence. And business intelligence has obviously grown into a very standard business unit within large organizations. But business intelligence, I think, has also become very internally focused over the years, and is focused very much on a company's internal metrics, often at the expense of competitive intelligence, because competitive intelligence is frankly just much harder to come by. But what I want to talk about is this notion that we really need both. We really need to have what we think of as full market intelligence in order to make sound decisions in the marketplace. So to give you an analogy, if you're only working with your own data and you look ahead to the future, it looks like the wide open road, and you're very excited about the strategies you can craft and where you see your organization going. But if in fact the road actually looks a lot more crowded, well, then you would adopt very different strategies. And I think this is a good analogy for thinking about this notion of why we need comprehensive market intelligence to really give us that sense of competitive insight. And so many of the executives that I talk to when I go around and I speak, I ask them how business is, and they'll say, well, it's great. My traffic is up X% and my conversion rate is up Y%, and only Z% of our customers who come to our site then go convert on Amazon. And I say, well, that's great. Those seem to be very impressive numbers. How do those stack up to the competition? And that's when I often get a lot of, semi-embarrassed shrugs that they don't really know. And this happens all the time. So just to give you a couple of concrete examples of how this often plays out, I've shown on the screen there some data from Angie's List. Now, there are many companies that are thinking about, should we put up a paywall? Should we take down our paywall? What's the best way to do this? Angie's List, about a year ago, took down their paywall, and of course they saw a big increase in people going to sign up pages, and that increase has remained above baseline levels even as we go now through 2017. So as an insight in isolation, you certainly see a surge, but the question is that high? Is that low compared to other companies who have done similar kinds of things? what's the metric for evaluating whether or not that was a successful initiative? Because if we stand back and then take a look at some of those same insights in a competitive context, we start to see a very different story. We see, for example, that over the past couple of years, Home Advisor has really come on, taking 13 percentage points of digital market share, which is a huge growth. And if you look at it year over year, as you see on the right-hand side of the slide, you really see the strong strength of Home Advisor, which again, if you're just one provider, you've got to have that competitive context in order to really make sound decisions. And this notion of competitive context is just one of the things that we think about in terms of digital market intelligence. Well, the notion of market intelligence also implies a comprehensiveness of understanding of the market. So if you're a brand, often you may not know many of the sites that are offering your product. In fact, when we do this analysis for clients, for brands, what we call a brand market landscape report, often we come back with hundreds or even thousands of retailers that a company may not have realized their brand was being sold on. So getting that full sense of the marketplace, being able to quantify volume, trends over time, not just traffic, but conversion as well. And finally, there's often for many brands kind of an unknown or gray market. And when they do this kind of broad brand landscape analysis, that they'll often find that there are many retailers that they didn't even realize were reselling their product, or wholesalers that are trying to sell directly to consumers. It's kind of an old saying that brands often get checks but not information from retailers, and that remains very much true. So that was really the first point that I wanted to make, that it's really important to have this digital market intelligence, a broad perspective on the marketplace, including that critical competitive intelligence. The second key that I wanted to talk about is to really just put some of the broader trends in context, that as we look at trends reshaping the digital landscape, you might think that, well, the digital revolution has been around for so long. Certainly we're seeing maturity in some of the key metrics that we might look at in terms of digital growth. But in fact, whether we're looking at digital ownership or digital usage or ad spending, we're seeing continued growth in all things digital. And so just to quickly give you 3 slides that'll sort of put some numbers around that. In the world, devices now outnumber people. We're at a point now where a majority of the world is connected. And even if you look at beyond those kinds of ownership metrics, which certainly in the U.S. and Western Europe are starting to plateau and reach full maturity, if you look at metrics around time spent with devices, you find those continue to increase, as you see there on the left-hand side of the slide. Some data from the well-known Mary Meeker report of digital intelligence. You see that time spent with digital devices continues to grow. And the fact is that not only are we spending more time on our devices, but our devices really have a tremendous understanding of what it is that we're interested in. Sometimes I kind of half-jokingly suggest that it'd be interesting to look at data, say, on divorces, and to look at, what % of divorces involve either a dating app or finding your old flame on social media or sexting or porn or whatever it might be. I would venture that, probably all divorces include one of those at some way or another. And my point is that our phones know our secrets, even those deepest desires that you might not even tell your spouse. Your phone is fully up to speed on it. Sometimes I use the phrase digitally infused lifestyles. We wouldn't even like to leave our phone aside when we go to use the bathroom. 70% of people use their phones while in the bathroom. In fact, sometimes I'm asked, is there anything that can dial back these trend toward digitally infused lifestyles and take people away from their devices? And sometimes I say, well, really only if people knew how disgustingly dirty their phones are from having used them in the bathroom. But I joke, but it's a very serious point that even things that you might think are a very mature category, such as e-commerce, continue to grow at really strong growth rates. Again, on this slide, some more data from the Mary Meeker report showing that online retail sales continue to grow at 15% a year. Usage of Amazon Prime is hitting about 2/3 of the population. You see that, especially if you look here in the United States, tremendous changes in the retail landscape. Well-known, long-beloved brands like Sears and Penny's and Kmart going out of business because of, in large part, the strength of e-commerce. It's reshaping the job market. Again, particularly here in the States, often a person's first job would be in many of the kind of retail outlets that are going out of business. And while there are more and more parcels being shipped, it's really causing huge redesign necessities in terms of dorms or apartment buildings. So many people are getting so many packages delivered that that living spaces like that need to be kind of mini warehouses. Even street grids in major cities are being redesigned. Where I live in San Francisco, in November and December, it's literally hard to drive around the city streets because there are so many delivery vans that are double parked. And so cities are starting to rethink even their traffic grid because there's so much e-commerce. It just continues to grow and grow and grow. So not only is e-commerce continuing to grow, despite you may be thinking, well, that's a pretty mature category, but if you look at digital ad spending, if we look in the US again, for example, digital ad spending has now surpassed television. It's over a third of all total ad spending. And if you just think about all the advantages that digital offers over television, the ability to hyper target, the ability to engage people while they're leaning forward and very much focusing on the information, the ability to quantify ROI, the relevance to younger consumers such as millennials. So digital ads are really just at the very beginning of, I think, their tremendous relevance in the marketing mix of today, which actually leads us to our next poll question. So I'll turn it back over to Jessica for that.
Thank you, Steve. Some very interesting stuff there. Okay, so just before we carry on to the next section, we wanted to run a little quiz for the audience. So I'm just going to put that on screen right now. So our question to you, doesn't matter if you get it right or wrong, it's just for fun, but what percentage of the top 100 websites traffic goes to the biggest 5, do you think? So those biggest 5 are Google, Facebook, YouTube, Yahoo, and Amazon. And after this poll, Steve will be revealing the answer to us. So we just really wanted to ask the audience and get your thoughts. So please vote now.
We are really putting the pressure on him here today.
It's a tricky one, I know, but it's got an interesting answer. So a couple more seconds for you all to vote, and then I'm going to close the poll and share with you what the audience thought. Okay, closing that now, and I will share the results. Okay, so 66% of you thought that the answer was that 85% of the top 100 websites traffic goes to those big 5. 23% of you thought it was 59%, and the rest of you thought it was smaller, 40 or 20%. So I will leave you with that, and then I will hand back to Steve now, who will show us the answer.
Okay, and the correct answer is actually 59%, which was guessed by about 1 out of 4 folks. And it was interesting that to the extent that people missed that question, they were overestimating the extent to which traffic is concentrated among just a few sites, which certainly is the broader takeaway from the next section that I wanted to talk about, the next key to digital success. As I put it, to know your place in the long tail. And we've long known that that many aspects of the internet follow this classic long tail distribution. So you see here, if we look at the top 100 sites, it was based on our quiz question, you get just about 60% of the traffic going to the 5 largest sites. And we've also added in there the source of revenue, which really kind of reinforces the importance of being a category dominator or if you're not a category dominator, to adopt a more of a niche strategy. So you see a huge drop from Google down to Facebook, both of them very ad driven, obviously dominating in the areas of search and social respectively, YouTube coming up third. It's interesting to see Yahoo, which is obviously a brand that has struggled in recent years, at least compared to its compatriots there in the top 5. And I think that just further reinforces the notion that it's really important to be a dominator, because you see that, you know, Yahoo didn't dominate in search, it didn't dominate in social. We'll see it does relatively well in news, but for a very ad focused company, it's hard to thrive even as a number 2. So this whole notion of a long tail distribution we see over and over again in our data. You know, here we're just looking at all the sites in general. If we were to go then to look at specific categories, we would see that same distribution over and over again. So as we look ahead to the next slide, one of the things that we want to do is just kind of quantify how different categories stack up in terms of being dominated by just a few sites. So on the vertical axis here, we have the amount of traffic that a category is getting. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the percent of all the traffic to the top 100 sites that's garnered by the top 5 sites. And as we'll see, admittedly, that notion of just picking 5 sites is kind of arbitrary. We do often see in long tail distributions, it's after the top 4 or 5 that things tend to really drop off. But one thing to point out is on this chart, I've not shown search or social, because if I did, they would be so far in the upper right, so dominated by a few sites and getting such a huge amount of traffic that all of the other categories would sort of be scrunched down in the lower left, and it would really be hard to see the nuances down there. So if we take out search and social, obviously huge outliers in the terms of the amount of traffic and being dominated by a few players, what do we see? We see you know, starting at the upper right. So again, looking at, you know, high volume categories that are dominated by a few. You see arts and entertainment. So that's going to be Netflix and YouTube falling in there. You see a reference as very dominated by a few sites. So that's largely driven by the strength of Wikipedia. If you look at adult websites in the US, for example, 3 of the top 15 sites are adult websites. I have no idea what goes on them because I've never been to any of them. Shopping, of course, dominated by Amazon. News and media, very much fueled by the strength of Yahoo in that area. But even if we look at some of the categories that are way over on the left, we still find this notion of they're often dominated by just a few sites. And as I said, it's a little bit arbitrary the way I chose the top 5 sites. So if you look, for example, at travel, comes across as you know, sort of being a David category where there are a lot of different players. Well, in part, that's because there are 2 really large players. There's Expedia and TripAdvisor, and even Expedia owns a lot of other websites. So there you see kind of a classic long tail distribution, but it falls off after those 2 big players. Or if you were to look at a category like food and drink, which again comes up as being sort of very dispersed by this particular metric, what you would find is that there are distinct subcategories within food and drink. So for example, there are a lot of recipe sites near the top. There are a lot of food delivery sites near the top, very different subcategories. If you looked at each of those separately, you would see, again, this classic long tail distribution. So over and over again, as all of you know, as was shown by the results of our poll, where you really get this sense of just how much traffic is dominated by a few sites. Well, if you're not one of those category dominators, then you've really got to refine your strategy of how you're going to work with those category dominators, or as I put it, dancing with the giants. And there are kind of 2 elements to this. First, you've got to optimize your channels in terms of dancing with the giants. And second, you've got to recognize that there's really been a paradigm shift in how people search. There's so much search now being done on site. So let's take a look specifically at e-commerce. Again, if we look at the top 100 sites, classic long tail distribution. And the same kind of notion that we saw before is that to really succeed at that broad end of the tail, you need to have a distinct thing that you can own. So obviously, Amazon is the 800-pound gorilla, to use a metaphor that we would use here in the States. Then you see eBay and Craigslist, again, with very strong positions in their own markets of marketplaces and classifieds. You've got Walmart as kind of being number 4 on this list, which in some ways is very much like Amazon and a competitor to Amazon. But in other ways, it attracts a very different kind of consumer, a more downscale consumer, as opposed to Amazon's success with more of the mass market and affluent consumers. So obviously, if you look at e-commerce, Amazon is that huge dominant player, and they dominate in so many ways. Not just the amount of traffic, not just in the volume of sales, also, for example, in their conversion rate. And this is another thing that we think is critically important that we're able to look at with our data. There are a lot of ways now to get traffic information, but there's more performance-related information, understanding of people who visit Amazon, what percent are putting something to the cart, what percent of those then convert. So for this particular analysis, we saw about 12% of Amazon users adding something to the cart, about 2/3 of those then converted to sales, and we figure in also one-click purchasing as well. And again, everything's got to be in a competitive context, and in a competitive context, 8% conversion rate is crushing it. It's industry leading. And Amazon is also finding ways to build even more strongly on that very strong performance. So they've done this, for example, with their Prime Day, which by every metric that we can look at really does seem to be a success. So if we look at Prime Day in 2017, we found that it boosted traffic over a typical June day for Amazon by 69%. That's a little bit ahead of what it was the previous year. I talked about this really impressive typical 8% conversion rate, roughly, depending on what time period you look at. And it was even stronger for last year's Amazon Prime Day. Not quite as high this year, but still a boost over what they had seen in the past. And I think one of the most interesting metrics of engagement with something like Prime Day is if you look way over on the left-hand side, you see that we've seen a large growth in the number of people essentially waiting until midnight the night before the sale and then hopping online immediately. I think it's a really interesting engagement metric. So what Amazon is doing here is one of several things, but importantly, it's shifting seasonality. There's tremendous seasonality to the retail business, and you probably all know of the phrase Black Friday. It's easy to forget that the way that phrase came into the lexicon is that for many retailers, it's not until Thanksgiving that they go into the black and start to turn a profit for the year. And obviously, no business would like that in an ideal world. So Amazon is trying to find ways to shift the seasonality. It's kind of an open question of whether retail holidays like this actually drive new sales, or if they're just moving around sales that would have happened at different times. Even if that's the only effect, which I'm not convinced that it is, that would still add value by shifting this seasonality, making their revenues more predictable throughout the year. So Amazon, obviously a huge player, having tremendous success in all kinds of dimensions. So as a brand, you've really got to figure out how are you going to dance with Amazon. So I think you need, again, full market intelligence for that. And by that, I mean a couple of key things that you've got to be able to look at. And here on this slide, we've got some data that we pulled from some work that we were doing on Bose. So first, if you're really going to dance effectively with that giant such as Amazon, you've got to understand the overlap. So how many people will go to your site and then go to Amazon, or vice versa? And then importantly, of the people who go to your site and to Amazon, what percent are purchasing on your site? What percent are purchasing on Amazon? In this particular example, over the particular time frame that we looked at, customers who'd been to both sites were 6 times more likely to purchase on Amazon. Obviously, for many, many brands, they would prefer to have as many direct sales as they possibly can, typically higher margins, typically a stronger relationship with the customer. But unless you're really able to quantify how much of your traffic is then converting on Amazon, it's really going to be hard to optimize your channel strategy. And we have seen some companies really rethink how they're working with Amazon. So perhaps having part of their product portfolio available on Amazon at certain prices, but then trying to reserve on their own site more exclusive, higher margin products that are going to be sold to those they may already have a strong relationship with. So optimizing channels really requires this full insight into conversion and what's going on a site. The other thing that's really crucial if you are going to effectively dance with a giant like Amazon is to know what's happening on that giant. Historically, when it comes to product discovery, so much of that went through traditional search engines. And now we're seeing in many categories a true paradigm shift for how people search for products. And very simply, many people will go to Amazon first and then start searching, or go to Walmart or whatever their preferred retailer might be. So just to pick one example, as we looked at searches for toilet paper, we found a relatively small number of searches on traditional search engines for toilet paper that ended up on Amazon. But if you looked at on-site search, you had 57 times more search activity going on Amazon. That information about what happens on Amazon has historically been hard to get, often limited, often expensive. But if you're really going to learn how to dance with the giant effectively, you've got to have the conversion and the on-site search information. Well, let me shift gears now and talk about one of the next keys to success, which is the notion of protecting your brand online and taming the Wild West. And I want to give you a few slides that give you some of the different ways that we can help brands protect themselves online. So, for example, by being able to look at the full landscape of all of the brands, of all of the search traffic for given terms, we're able to understand when piracy sites might pop up. So, for example, we've shown here the amount of traffic that for people searching for The Walking Dead, or we're working on a similar analysis right now for Game of Thrones, and it's a very similar kind of thing. That if you look at how much search traffic is generated around those terms, it's quite a bit. If you look at where that traffic gets directed to, well, you often see, as in this example, really up at the top are often piracy-related sites. They'll often pop up very quickly, have a huge jump in traffic, then they'll be shut down, and then a similar site will open up right away. I sometimes call it whack-a-site, like that kids game, whack-a-mole, where it keeps popping up. So one of the things that can be done here is not only understanding, all right, where might there be illegal streaming downloads? How can we try to shut those down? But you can also do what I call playing SEO defense, in the sense that what you might find is that you're particularly losing a lot of traffic based on certain search terms. So it might be, for example, The Walking Dead streaming, or The Walking Dead season 7. And knowing where you're particularly losing out on particular search terms allows you to kind of beef up your SEO in those areas, and, as we call it, play SEO defense. Another way that we have kind of helping brands protect themselves and protect their businesses is by trying to understand what we think of as the digital fingerprint of nefarious sites. So, for example, we were doing some analysis over Memorial Day weekend in the United States to try to understand how does consumer behavior differ over long weekends like that. And you often find sites like this that have a certain digital fingerprint of going from zero to massive traffic. It often comes with, from just one or two sources, whether it be referrals or so on. Very high bounce rate, meaning that 96% of people just went to this one page and then left that site immediately, or very little time spent. And again, when we see this kind of whack-a-site, when this kind of site would show up, would then get shut down, often another site would pop up with a very similar digital fingerprint. One of the companies that we work with is a digital payment site. And every day they get literally hundreds of their customers emailing them saying, oh, I think I might have fallen prey to a phishing scam. I think I might have made a purchase on a site that now I think isn't what I thought it was. And so these kinds of companies need a way to, at scale, start to identify what might be nefarious sites. And we often do that through this kind of digital fingerprinting. The final example that I wanted to give you about protecting your brand online comes up in the area of often kind of being a media currency, looking at how publishers present themselves to advertisers, and with the starting point of talking about how much advertising is going to cost. So here I've shown first using the metric of page views. Two particular publishers, and one I've called Publisher C, because if I were to talk about the name, you would recognize it as a relatively politically conservative leaning site, and Publisher L, which you would recognize as a more liberal leaning site. And if we're just looking at page views, you're thinking, wow. And again, here we're looking at U.S. data. You would think, well, this conservative publisher is really crushing it. That really tells us something about how the political climate is shaping how people consume news online. So this is looking at page views. But if we look at visitors, we start to see a very different pattern where it looks like, well, this liberal publisher is not only getting more visitors, but it also really got a spike around election time in the United States. And although traffic has fallen off a little bit since then, it's maintained among those baseline levels. So what's going on here? Well, part of the answer comes by looking at pages per visit. And there we see kind of the strong growth for this conservative publisher. But then if you really look into the source code of this website, you see they've got an auto refresh in there. So if you were to just open up that tab and then go off and open up some other tabs and do some other things, that even while you're not looking at that one tab, it keeps refreshing. It keeps cranking up page views. So this is one of the ways that many of our clients will often use us as kind of a supplement to the traditional currency studies out there, really getting a good sense of all the different metrics that might be shaping a publisher's claims about how much traffic they're getting. Well, the final key to digital success that I want to talk about is inferring insights from actions. My background is in market research, and I'm really trained as a social scientist. And quite often we're asking people questions about why they engage in certain behaviors. Well, now that I'm working very much with digital behavior, we're exploring different ways to kind of read the tea leaves, to infer simply from digital behavior more about the why, about the attitudes, about the daily life of consumers, almost from an ethnographic perspective. One of the things that I like to do here is looking at the different forms of temporal patterns, meaning over time. So for example, I spoke last month at a conference for the global classifieds industry, which is, for example, Craigslist. And you see some very interesting patterns. You notice that line is very spiky. That reflects weekly spikes, where Monday people want to get their life together and apply for that new job and clean out their garage and plan the garage sale and those kinds of things. And so you see strong traffic on Monday that goes down throughout the week. You see some holiday season dips, which it's sort of the counter trend that you would see through traditional retail. But when people are not focused on the kinds of things they would do on classified sites around the holidays, you see those dip. And then you also see what you might call local maxima, as the economists would put it, around graduation seasons in the spring, and then around school enrollment seasons in the fall, is when you see a lot of people moving. You see a lot of students wanting to sell furniture, buy furniture. You start to see the patterns over time in people's lives. We can do the same thing, for example, if we look at our app data, if we just look at throughout the course of a day. So for example, if you look at a consumer finance app like Mint, you see that peak very early in the morning. If you look at a to-do list app like AnyDo, you see that peak a little bit later, about 9 a.m., as opposed to the financial site of 7 a.m. If you look at some of the games, you see those start to peak after school. If you look at Minecraft Pocket Edition, which is often at the very top of the list of paid apps. I have a 13-year-old son whose mind has been taken over by Minecraft, so I know a lot about this. And then as you see games with perhaps more of an adult audience, you see those peaking a little bit later. And if you want to know what apps peak latest in the day, it's Netflix and chilling in a sense. So you really start to get the sense of the ebb and flow of consumers' lives, as I said, almost from an ethnographic perspective. Well, before I finish up with some broad takeaways, I did want to talk a little bit about a global perspective, because a lot of the data that I've shown are US based, and certainly the broad themes that I've talked about are very much true as we look at data throughout the world. So the whole notion of long tail distribution, the critical importance of category dominators, of brands having to learn to dance with the giants, of this whole notion of whack a site, of once piracy sites get shut down, other sites with the same digital fingerprint pop up. All of those things are very much global phenomena. But there are some things that we do see differ around the world, and I wanted to talk about those a little bit. So I'm about to show you in a second what will look like kind of a complex heat map. It's going to show in kind of a country by country grid, where we've basically taken our data and done some modeling and try to understand how one country's internet use tends to influence others. So as we as I bring up the heat map, and as I said, it's kind of a country by country grid, you start to see certain patterns. So on this chart, yellow is going to mean more influence from a country. Red is going to mean very little influence. And if you look across a row, you're going to see how influential a country is. So for example, as you look across the top, as you see the English-speaking countries, you see that English remains very much the lingua franca of the internet. And those English-speaking countries are having a large influence in terms of how people are searching, the kinds of websites they're going to, the kind of activities they engage in. As you look at Western Europe, you start to see a little bit more red. As you see different countries with different languages, their influence on each other becomes a little bit more muted. As we look to the Eastern Bloc, or specifically to Russia, you then start to see much more, in a sense, isolation, little influence of those countries on surrounding countries. The one exception that sort of stands out there is Russia having a lot of influence on the Ukraine. You can see that there on the chart. If you take a look at the sites in Central and South America, again, you see the importance of language, of culture, of Spanish-speaking countries having a lot of influence on each other. The one outlier within that box, of course, is Brazil, which has stronger relationships in many ways to Portugal because of language. As you see kind of a bright yellow box of all of the Middle Eastern countries, again, sharing language, sharing culture, much more influence and much more similar to each other in terms of their internet usage patterns. Then you tend to see a very dark line for China, which we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about apps. One of the phrases that you'll hear out there these days is the splinter net, which is this idea that the internet experience, the kind of sites you go to, the kinds of activities you do, tend to differ across different countries and different regions. And here we certainly see that, and we see the tremendous importance of language and those patterns of influence. Now, everything you see on this slide is based on influences around web traffic, including desktop and mobile web. But what's really interesting then, if we take a look at the app economy, you see much more influence. It's a much more globally coherent marketplace with many countries influencing many other countries. There's much more of kind of a shared sense of these are the apps that a lot of people are using. The ones that really stand out as being very different, China, also Taiwan and Japan. If you go to China, so much happens on WeChat. In Taiwan, it's a similar kind of thing with Line. And these are kind of super apps in a sense. In China, imagine using WeChat. Imagine your all-in-one app, your Google, your Facebook, your Amazon, your texting, your eBay. It's all there in one place. So it's very vertically integrated. But you see how that's really kind of the exception to the rest of the globally integrated app world. So I wanted to finish up with just kind of a couple of broad takeaways, and then we'll open it up to some questions. I did want to revisit this notion of market intelligence is business intelligence plus competitive intelligence, and that competitive intelligence has really got to include conversion rates on competitors. It's got to include understanding on-site search, because that is kind of a big paradigm shift. We've seen all around the world this notion of P&G used to say they wanted to be in a given category first, second, or not play. And here in the internet, I think you want to be first, maybe second, or if not, to recognize that you are a long-tailed play, more of a niche passion player, and finding ways to dance with those giants. A couple of broader takeaways that we see, just as we see category dominant sites becoming more and more dominant, we've also seen kind of a shifting definition of SEO success. It used to be about getting on that first page. Now increasingly, it's getting to number one. When we look at purchasing patterns, we still see a lot of purchasing happening on desktop. There's certainly a lot of information gathering that happens on mobile, but when it comes to that final step of making a purchase, making a financial transaction, often people then switch to the desktop, whether it's the psychological comfort of a keyboard or their own comfort with going home and doing it on their own Wi-Fi network. We see that's an opportunity for a brand to perhaps get lost in that device switch. We often see first mover advantages, which I think really reinforces the importance of having this comprehensive market intelligence. We've seen a growing use case of our data in the investment world, with venture capital firms wanting to get, not insider information, but rather what we think was kind of outside information. This kind of information that you get on competitors. You can look to see who's growing, how are they growing? Are they growing by spending a lot of money on pay-per-click in a way that's actually going to depress their eventual profit margins? So we do see that as kind of a growing use case. And finally, I do think there is within our industry a big shift from merely traffic measurement to a recognition that to really make sound decisions in the marketplace, you've got to have that full digital market intelligence, which is going to include performance metrics around conversion as well as on-site information. So I know that was a lot of information, but now I'm going to open it back up. And Jessica, do we have some questions coming in?
We do. So first of all, thank you so much, Steve. That was an incredibly insightful presentation. I'm sure everybody has a few action items to take now, but regardless, it was absolutely fascinating and to hear all about this world that we all live in. So thank you very much. We've had several questions come in, and I just want to remind everyone, you can still ask your questions and we'll get to as many of them as possible today in the last 10 minutes. And if we don't get them today, we'll be in touch with you afterwards. So please do keep those questions coming in. Okay, so one of the questions we had was just about that last section of your presentation, Steve, where you showed the heat maps, and wondering if you could expand a little more detail about what you mean by influence. So when we said that certain countries are highly influential and others less, a bit more detail on maybe what that means.
Yeah, it's a really interesting set of analyses, and to go into the mathematics we could spend another hour on it. But as we look across the rows in those heat maps, we're looking at the amount of influence that a country has on other countries, and that's around certain metrics of first the specific sites that they're going to, but also looking at the categories of sites that they go to, as well as certain patterns around their behavior, the amount of time spent on certain sites and so on. So you certainly do get that sense of, as I said, kind of the splinter net when you're looking at the web in and of itself, of the experience being different in different parts of the world. So and you do see that tremendous importance of language. And like I said, many of the broad takeaways that we talked about are certainly valid around the world. I mean, specifically this notion of long-tail distributions. We see that over and over again. We see, the category dominators as by and large increasing their domination. And it's true here in the United States. It's true in many, many countries around the world. So it's certainly at the point where for most brands, you can't walk away from one of those giants. We have seen, for example, here in the United States, a number of brands start to rethink their strategy of how they're going to work with Amazon. Very few sites can say, you know what, we're just pulling out of Amazon for a couple of reasons. I mean, there are some examples of that. Birkenstock has famously, in recent months, come out and made a lot of headlines saying that they're going to pull out of Amazon. A lot of it has to do with issues around counterfeits. And it's certainly a delicate balancing act to, for example, be on Amazon, get the benefits of Amazon's wide reach, get some consumers that you wouldn't have had otherwise, but also still keeping a lot of that direct traffic to yourself. And again, just saying, oh, we're not going to have a presence on Amazon really does not mean not having a presence on Amazon. It means allowing your presence to be controlled by resellers and wholesalers, often with not the same level of commitment to service that you're going to have, opening the doors up to counterfeits. And we've seen that in the United States, and we see that even more dramatically in other countries. So those are some of the similarities and differences that we see around the world, Jessica.
Great, thank you so much. We're getting a few requests here. If you could just flick back to that heat map slide, probably the first one with the websites, just because people want to take a look at that again, and people want to print screen that as well, which you're welcome to do. I will, just to let you know, we will be following up after the webinar ends. We will follow up with the recording of the webinar and the deck, so you can refer back to that. And if you want to share it with any of your colleagues that haven't been able to join us today as well. I think we still have time for one or two more questions. So Stephen, you talked about the 6 keys to winning the digital marketing wars today, and you covered a lot of information there, but if you had to choose just one of those 6 principles, which one do you think is the most important one for companies to focus on?
It's interesting because I would really choose the first one, this notion of stop flying blind. And I think it's so interesting because when we asked our poll question, that was the one where, the fewest people said that was important to them. But as I said, I know this happens with you as well, Jessica, that when we go around the world, we speak at conferences, we work with many of the world's leading brands, it's often really kind of surprising how little information they have about what competitors are doing. Particularly when it comes to conversion rates, particularly when it comes to understanding the kind of search patterns that are going on those sites. So I think that would be the number one that I would choose. And I think the second one would be this notion of dancing with the giants, of really understanding how do you optimize your channels in an era where a few sites are dominating so much of the traffic. And there's also this whole, as I said, paradigm shift in search, that it used to be that so much of search for products and discovery of new products was happening on traditional search engines. And now we're seeing in many cases where a majority, in some cases a vast majority of the searching is happening on sites such as Amazon, which has historically been very hard information to find. So those are the 2 that I would pick.
Great. The next question is, do you think that messaging apps like Viber and WhatsApp and others will replace emails and social networks soon? And also, do you think in the near future that mobile will totally kill desktop?
Mm-hmm. Those are really thought-provoking questions. Certainly, we have seen huge growth in mobile web. So first just looking at mobile web versus desktop, which is kind of the easiest thing to get kind of apples to apples trending of over time. We're now at the point where it's just about a 50-50 split, and every year it's been more and more mobile. That's certainly true in terms of traffic. But as I said, if you look at actual purchases, purchasing is still much more likely to be happening on desktop. Financial transactions are still much more likely to be happening on desktop. That's also true around the world. I certainly see in much of the developing world, and in a sense went straight to mobile. You are seeing more mobile purchasing, but even in those countries, you still see a tremendous amount of desktop-based purchasing. So clearly the trend is toward mobile web, is toward apps, but it's going to be a while before purchasing is really dominated by apps in the same way. So that was the answer to the second question. Remind me again what the first question was.
The first question was, do you think that messaging apps such as Viber and WhatsApp will replace emails and social networks soon?
I would say certainly in terms of email, we do anecdotally at least see people, a little bit less engaged with that. If you look, for example, of a lot of companies that have, really built a focus on building up their email lists, we do again anecdotally see, fewer people signing up for email lists as people's inboxes become more and more crowded. And so text, and particularly opening up the possibility of chatbots and so on, does offer, I think, a more direct way to get to people. Even just at work, people will often say, well, if you really want to get me, you got to text me, because email is going to be a slower response. It's not as engaging. So certainly we have seen a trend. It's going to be a while, I think, before messaging completely replaces email. But clearly the trend is in that direction as well.
Fantastic. I think that's all we've got time for today. So thank you everyone that asked your questions, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to them all today, but we will be in touch with you afterwards, and feel free to reach out to us as well. But thank you all so much for joining today, and thank you, Stephen, for the fascinating presentation.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.